Welcome again, everyone, to the fourth session on experiencing no self. So today we're going to be looking at struggle. As you perhaps surmised from the guided meditation, it's really the invitation of what meditation is. When you really think about it, it's, what are we doing? We get all these instructions, but ultimately it's simply an invitation to let go of struggle with what's arising moment by moment. We've been involved in all kinds of different meditation techniques, but I think when you boil all those away, that's I think the essence, the art of meditation. So from my my investigation of my own experience in meditation, I've kind of come to the realization that the essence of the Four Noble Truths, which we've covered here, is also talking about struggle. This word struggle that I often use. So any grasping, pushing away, or as the Buddha would say, craving and clinging, is struggle. It's what the ego does to remain center stage. So it's really the opposite of allowing things to be as they are, right? We're struggling with some aspect of our experience. We don't like something, we want to push it away. Maybe a busy mind rises when we don't like that. Oh, I want to get rid of that. And it could be, very obvious, or it can be very subtle, this kind of struggle that goes on. And have you noticed that when you're not struggling with what's arising in your experience, that the egoic self disappears? When you're not struggling, you're just being. You're kind of in a being mode, a being realm, with just okay with what is. The ego disappears. You don't get rid of it. It's just no longer there. And I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by no longer there. And so these are moments that we've all had, right? It could be a moment of awe when you see a sunset. Have you noticed that? When you sometimes when you just watch the beautiful sky, sometimes at a sunset or a sunrise, and there's peace and there's quiet, and you're in awe of that moment, that the ego just disappears all on its own. The I and the me are no longer center stage. You're just in awe of the moment. I think we've all probably had that experience. I know when we travel, for some people when they're traveling seem to want to have this experience because there'll be like lineups to get to a place where you get a good place to see a sunset. I've experienced this many times, and there's big crowds of people. I've always wondered what's the allure of a sunset. I mean, it happens every day. Yet we'll line up, even buy tickets to see a sunset. Maybe there's a pull. Maybe there's a pull to that moment, even if it's just a little moment of stillness, of when the struggle ceases and the ego, the I and the me movement in the mind ceases. Is something we all desire. It could be when we look into the eyes of a beloved one. Just the moment where the ego disappears. A newborn baby has this effect on me. Just seeing a newborn baby, it's a moment of wonderment, of the mystery of this birth. The I disappears. The ego disappears. It could be when you're fully engaged in an activity. We've talked about this, People have stories, when they're playing music, they're totally engaged in a sport or an activity of some kind. The ego disappears. When I think back, I did whitewater kayaking for many, many years and many, many hours. Those were moments where the ego would disappear. You don't have room for egos, and when you're flying down whitewater in a little piece of plastic. So these are all these kinds of moments. And such moments have occurred for all of us. When the ego simply disappears. So the ego, since the ego is in this kind of constant state of struggle, right? It's constantly struggling to remain at the center. When the struggle ceases, so goes the ego. And this is the me that we've been talking about. So these are moments, in the first session, I talked about moments where we transcend the ego. So the ego hasn't fallen away. It comes right back, right? You have that moment of, the sunset, the ego disappears, the sun sets and everybody, the ego jumps back in, right? So it's the ego hasn't fallen away, but it is a moment of transcending the ego. And the ego struggles, so we can say, why does the ego struggle? Now, the ego struggles because we think we have to be happy. Right? It's simply our conditioning playing out. The ego simply is responding, reacting, playing out its conditioning. We believe that if we get what we want, avoid what we don't want, that we'll be happy. That we can find this happiness. The ego can find happiness in having all the exterior circumstances, the environment just right. That we will be happy. And this is a deeply held belief, right? And since it actually works sometimes, right? Sometimes you get some momentary happiness. The ego there's some happiness that arises from getting what you like, getting what you want, getting rid of what you don't want. So it actually plays out. So there's actually some direct experience even that reinforces this belief. So you could say that human existence is defined by an ongoing struggle with what is. It's just this ongoing struggle with what is, kind of interspersed with moments of peace. There's moments of peace interspersed here and there. Basically, a struggle, a continuous struggle with what is. We human beings can drink too much, we can eat too much, we can talk too much, we can meditate too much, can take drugs, can spiral down whitewater rivers, can watch TV, leave the radio on all the time. All these are distractions, right? Because without these distractions, we'll start struggling. We'll always start struggling. And we all want this prolonged period, this prolonged experience, I should say, of not struggling. We want this prolonged experience of not struggling. So we know that we grasp, right, and avoid. You all know this, right? And even you don't even need to, be told about the Four Noble Truths to know that we all grasp and avoid. We've explored in numerous sessions here how this arises and how this causes suffering. We talk about the cause of suffering and the path to its cessation. What the Buddha taught. I teach the suffering and the end of suffering. So something that I've been contemplating, reflecting on recently is, why is this all occurring? I know I often say why doesn't matter, but this is one instance where why is this occurring? There's something that I've just felt there's something that needs to be seen here. Why do we struggle and create in the process, create so much misery for ourselves? And I'll pose this question to you folks, just for any comments that you might have to that question. Why do we struggle and create so much suffering for ourselves? I've said many times in this group that I know somewhere between 90 and 95% of our suffering we create ourselves. It's unavoidable suffering. It's optional suffering that we create. And we've heard this, and in many ways we know this. So why do we keep doing it? Why do we struggle? I guess the silence is an indication that it's something that we all need to contemplate and reflect on. I mean, the Buddha said we struggle because of ignorance. Like the basic teachings, the word gets translated as ignorance. It's delusion is another word it's used, translation. So it's a misunderstanding about the nature of reality. Right? And the primary misunderstanding is the nature of self. Well, that's how the Buddha would have, approached this. There's this misperception is another word I like to use in terms of ignorance. Misperception, misunderstanding of the nature of reality, and in particular, the nature of self. So, sorry, Carl. Yeah. Sorry.
You're bringing back to my days as a sociologist, to be honest with you, and the thing that comes to my mind is the nature of language, and how as we kind of evolve as a human being, we're taught language, and our language is really centered on like dualisms, and centered on on the first words we kind of learn are who somebody else is and who we are, and and as we grow, our language becomes more complicated, and and it becomes more part of a kind of a tacit awareness that we no longer know we have. So we create this this world, right? I mean, and we do it all the time. We do it when we form relationships. We get in little microcultures that we think are normal until we meet somebody else. So I think the issue of socialization is basically one of those things in which one builds one's own cage, and one builds one's own ego and one's own self. You can't have a self without language, right? You have to. That's how you get it. And I look at Buddhism as one of those ways of kind of looking at those taken for granted aspects of one's reality and one's consciousness. And it's really hard to kind of move away from a uh, move away from how one's mind is built on a language structure, right? And because Buddhism, they talk about, like, I cannot put into language what being in a nirvana state is, because there is no language for that, right? It's only I could tell you what it's not, I can tell you what it sort of stands for, but it's like it defies a linguistic structure, so I know that's how I see it. I mean, that's why in some ways I what's interesting about Buddhism is letting go of that, and it's really hard because you've spent your whole life using language, being part of a social world in which yourself is intrinsically involved in everything that you do. When you're walking down the street, you're looking at somebody else and you're assessing them, and then that they're looking at you and assessing you, right? So I find that's a real hard thing to kind of let go and to understand, right? And that's all in mind, self, and society.
Thank you. Yeah.
A long-winded
Mm.
statement. Thanks.
Yeah. How language reinforces the belief in a egoic self. As like Joseph Goldstein likes to practice, I think I brought this up recently, is restating things in terms of, rather than saying, I am angry, saying anger has arisen or anger is present. So it's just a little different way, but still using words. The language is by nature dualistic, as you say, so it reinforces all the dualisms that prevent us from seeing. They don't prevent us from seeing it. That's not true. They reinforce the misperception of the nature of reality. Yeah. Anybody else? Something to add? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering about how struggling sort of maintains this illusion that we have some control over what happens. Like, if only I do the right thing, then I'll be able to make things the way I need them to be. So I keep struggling to find what is that perfect right thing so that I can have some control over my world.
Yeah. Yeah, the illusion of control. That's a tough one for the ego to give up, right? That's bad news. Bad news for the ego. The ego thinks it's firmly got its grip on the steering wheel of life, right? And it's controlling life. When reality is, life is simply unfolding. The ego is not, doesn't have control, doesn't have ability to steer life. Life happens to us. Yeah. So the element of control. So you're pointing there, Juna, to the ego's real struggle to remain center stage, right? Is part of this, and the ego's struggle to, it can only find happiness through struggle, right? And of course, if you're struggling with what is, you're suffering because you never get what you want and get rid of what you don't want. So you're setting yourself up for failure. Right? It's like if you're how can I say this? If you think you're in control, then of course it's your fault when things go wrong. Does that make sense? Right? If you, as an egoic mind, if you believe that you're in control, which the ego does, then of course there's there's going to be self-judgment and blame because I believe I should have been able to prevent this, right? Because I'm in control. So it's really, you can just see how that sets us up for kind of a cascade of more suffering. But this is a an interesting, one of the few why questions that I would introduce into this group is, but why does this keep happening? We can hear the Four Noble Truths, we can study it, we can see again and again how we create extra suffering for ourselves in our minds. We can see that, we can see, again and again that when this ceases, suffering ceases, but the ego jumps right back in and struggles again. Have you noticed that? You can have these insights. Oh yeah, I see that. I can see clinging creates suffering. I see it. I just saw, I've seen it in my daily experience. But the ego then jumps right back in and struggles again. So in my practice, I've been trying to stop being so concerned about the fact that I do struggle. So I'm just accepting that the ego struggles. That's just what it does, right? So I'm not too concerned about that. I've come to that kind of conclusion in my own practice. So this way, by sort of accepting that this is the nature of ego, and ego struggles to remain center stage, this way I found I don't get caught up in avoiding struggle or judging myself for struggling, right? I'm not struggling with the struggle that's arising. So I continuously, and I spent the week really, really deeply practicing this, is continuously noticing when struggle was taking place and accepting that it was occurring. So this is the invitation for you for the week, is to don't judge that the fact that struggling arises. This is a real twist on what I've been saying for some years to many of you. So we're not letting go of struggle doesn't mean, we're trying to stop it. In this way, we're just accepting, we're recognizing and accepting the struggle has occurred. And this is really, I think, the first step for this. Of course, then I started wondering why I struggle at all, especially when I kept seeing that my struggling made me feel miserable and uneasy. The question starts to arise, okay, I see that this struggling makes me uneasy and miserable. Why does it keep arising? I began to notice that it felt really good, felt peaceful and still when I wasn't struggling. But it doesn't last long, right? And then we jump in and struggle again. Even when I got what I wanted, the ego struggles once more, wants to make sure it gets it again. It struggles. So I kept holding this kind of question in awareness. Why do I struggle at all? So it wasn't an intellectual exercise at all. It was just kind of holding the question, posing the question into the space of awareness and letting, just holding and letting what appears to appear. So I started to notice that there are moments when I'm not struggling. We've all had this, prolonged moments when there's no struggling present, and it just happens. And it just happens sometimes. And this is when I started to notice that, well, when I'm not struggling, it's when I'm being struck by awe or wonderment or full engagement or love. in some way. And that's in those moments, something disappears. The ego disappears. The I, the me that's center stage, disappears. Have you noticed that every time you're struck by awe, wonderment, as I described it, the I, the me disappears. And all this means is you're not thinking about yourself. That's all that means. The struggle stops when you're not thinking about yourself. Yes, Carl? Yeah.
I just wanted to add something to this. And it's I was watching the Olympics today, and I was watching the high jumping, or the pole vaulting. I mean, and what was interesting about that, and it relates to what you're saying, is that there's a moment it's a process, and as I was watching the pole jumpers run towards the pole and jumping over, you could tell that they were totally in the moment. They were totally in that I, and where they were just pure subject. And then when they hit a spot where they actually got over the top, their facial expression totally changed, and they kind of became one in which they were the me. They became the object where they thought, I made it over the top, and they were happy. It was a fascinating thing. It happened for everybody that did that. And for me, that was where you got a chance to see how they went from being totally, like I said, in the moment to being, in the ego. And it didn't take very long. It was a really interesting thing to watch. It was fascinating, not just like sports wise, but just from a self point of view. It was neat. And I think it's what you're talking about. In a flash.
Yeah. 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 Of course, that's a whole other topic which we could explore is in engaged in some activities and entering flow, and how that is moments of the dissolving of ego. Some of I did some teaching with a MPEAK, which is for athletes, mindfulness and athletic athletes, and that's very much what it's about, is entering into the place where the ego disappears, and performing whatever sport or whatever activity you're doing from that place, and seeing how that actually enhances the performance. Because the ego just starts getting involved. It's a lot of thoughts and judging, and takes you away from the best that you can do in the activity. It takes you out of what is called what's called flow sometimes. So that's part of perhaps people have experienced that too. Or I know Carl's brought up music in the past as well as an activity where this happens. But I think the one that we can all relate to is the sunset. I've said this one to, I've never had anybody go, no, I've never had the experience of the ego disappearing when I've got that moment of awe. Whatever moment of awe is for you, whether it's a sunset or something else. Birth of a child is another one for me that. So just noticing those moments. So in many ways, all the sort of philosophical questions about, who we are, what we are, or if we are, really don't matter. What matters is that we see directly in our moment-to-moment experience that when the thoughts of I and me, when we're not preoccupied with ourselves, when the awe is center stage rather than the me, that the ego has been transcended in those moments. And dwelling in that direct experience of the transcending of ego. And you've all had many moments like this, right? We've all had many moments like this. And we've all had these moments, yet in the midst of these moments, what likely happens is we quickly begin to struggle again. Have you noticed that? The awe moment, this just awe-inspiring moment, and the peacefulness and the easefulness, and then boom, the ego's right back, and rather quickly. It's almost the more you're conscious of this process, the more startling it actually feels. Like boom, the ego's back. Like thoughts, me, preoccupations, and so the thoughts of I, me, and mine just arise, and it's almost like we can't bear those moments for very long. Well, in fact, the ego can't bear those moments for very long. The ego must be center stage, so jumps right back in. We put ourselves, the ego, back in center stage, and we struggle again. So if you stopped struggling, right, which is what the invitation of the practice is, if you stop struggling, you would not be center stage anymore. Right? If you stopped, which is the invitation of this practice, you're all here by the mere fact that you're here. And I've said this so many times, but it's so important. The mere fact that you're here on a beautiful, you're staring at a computer screen on a beautiful August evening, right? It's just gorgeous outside. I mean, it's the temperature's perfect for walking, biking. It's just, and yet you're here staring at a computer screen, right? What does that you've been culled in some way. There, consciousness is yanking at you pretty hard for you to do this. Consciousness is literally screaming to be seen. Your true nature is screaming to be seen. And at the same time, the ego's not wanting to let go. The ego's, I want to be like center stage, like deep down, there's a knowing in the ego that if I stop struggling, it's the death of me. Right? So you've got this dynamic that's going on. Yes, Nick. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, this is very intriguing. I can sense a sense of resistance in me with regards to this. And when I go back to the question, why do we struggle?
Yeah.
I can't seem to shift the idea that we struggle to make things better. We struggle to find challenges in the world, things that aren't working correctly or the way that we would like them to, or that are so hard that we struggle to find new ways to hopefully find more peace, more time. I mean, if you think back to the 1950s, it was all, this new technology will make it so you have more time at home with your family. And yet, here we are. But for me, the struggle is always around trying to achieve stuff or trying to better our lifestyle. And I know some of that, is physical stuff, but even mentally, I mean, I'm here to try and improve myself. So there's always this struggle. And then for me, every so often there's this this, and it can be a simple, moment. It's almost like, mentally you're putting the last piece of the puzzle in. It goes like, wow, or it could be the sunset or something that you've been working on, but then all of a sudden it kind of like, oh, you see a path, it hasn't been succeeded, but you see a way through it. And for me, there's always this struggle before the R. And I'm having like a hard time, or I'm resisting the fact that you can just be in that moment or let go and that moment will happen, as opposed to like even with the Olympics, there's the struggle of all of the training and then the moment when it all comes together and you're in flow. So I always seem to feel that there's that struggle before you see the moment. anyway, so that's my resistance.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. So there's so much in what you said, but mine's going in all different directions. Um, so the struggle. So when we hear "let things be as they are," often, and we hear the word acceptance, what comes up for the ego is, so this means I'm just going to be a doormat, or I'm just going to accept the way the world is. I'm not going to try and improve things. I'm not going to try to better, myself. I'm not going to, I'll just become a, kind of lazy blob. Here's my true nature. I'm a lazy blob. I don't have to do it because I'm just accepting. And that's not, and that's really a story the ego tells us. It's a story of the ego. It's thoughts, right? It's the ego going, oh, that can't be. That if this is going to go there, I don't want that. I'll stick with making a better ego, right? Like the self-improvement part I get, because that'll make me a better ego. I'll be such a good ego that everybody will love me. I'll probably love myself, right? If I could just be that improved, new and improved ego. And so the ego loves that story, but it doesn't like the story, accept things as they are. Well, how am I going to become the super, the best ego? So the part of the resistance is, oh, I can't just accept things the way they are. And we're not, and in fact, when we accept things the way we are, we're very engaged. So we're the wisdom, what we engage in comes from wisdom, as opposed to the egoic mind. So the ego has nothing to do with what will happen next. It arises spontaneously from wisdom, from what's required in the moment. But it's very engaged, right? It's just an engagement from a place of wisdom. So, and that's actually a future session that we're going to have is, I think what came up for me was a title like too much emptiness is not good. So, right, because you can lose your conduct in the view of too much emptiness, but you also, and it can be a problem. So there has to be wisdom that comes in, that arises with this, so that our actions in the world, our social justice actions, whatever arises for you spontaneously from that place of wisdom. Maybe it's being engaged in the world, and maybe it's doing other things, but it's coming from that place of wisdom rather than the place of the ego. And this is like a crucial struggle that goes on for us as we engage in this this practice. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, and I'll just say that we will talk about how too much emptiness can actually cause problems as well. The ego can latch on to, I can be that. I can be empty. you know, the ego can be can like can latch on to enlightenment. Right? I can be enlightened. Think of how people will love me when I'm enlightened. Right? I'll be compassionate, kind, and enlightened. And geez, that sounds like pretty much the best, right, ego project that there can be, right? And we can really the ego's Adyashanti says the ego shapeshifter. So it'll kind of shift, oh, you don't want me to be that, I'll just be this, and it just kind of slides back in as and many people get caught in that that entrapment of the egoic craving for enlightenment, and it coming from more from this from a more egoic mind, because the ego, yeah. Go ahead.
Hello, sorry, Stephen. I was just thinking as you were talking, I'm an island girl, so everything I'm about is the ocean. So I was thinking of this concept of releasing ego as telling me, there's this ocean you've been swimming in your whole life, but guess what? You can also breathe underwater. So just trust that as you go underwater, you're going to breathe. It's unknown. I'm so scared of this. People have told me that this beautiful place exists, but I'd rather swim and struggle and not drown than go underwater. And then what if I can't breathe under there? So I guess my point is, I'd rather struggle and have this opposing force of the yin and the yang and the duality and feel horrible and feel great, than go to this void where, as you said, I might die. So I feel like it's the fear of the unknown. I mean, I'd rather, go to extreme things, feel really sad and feel really happy and get up on stage and tell people tell me that I'm beautiful and feel all these feelings than just be in a void. That sounds my ego's like, that sounds kind of boring. I'd rather have all these feelings. I don't want to lose all these things. I want to be attached to my kids. I want to continue worrying about them because that means I love them. So I guess for me, the idea of transcending the ego temporarily, super cool. Letting go of the ego completely, what? And then what? I'm just going to be in this boring flatline void for the rest of my life? Ew, I'd rather stay with the struggle. That's kind of the thoughts that are coming to my head right now. So that's all. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Well put. Yeah, the ego, there's a kind of death. The ego knows this, and there's a deep fear of and as you to the ego, it's a void, because it can't be known by the mind. So it's that's why we talk about letting go into the unknown, not knowing. How not knowing, beginner's mind, is so central to the practice as well. But the ego deeply fears its own demise, and it'll quickly go back to struggling. And that's a deep fear, and and I've mentioned here before that this is something that I've had to deal with in my life. Went through prolonged period of just deep peace and ease, and the only time there was struggle was in my dream state. So I would, and I still have this. My sleeping heart rate is 10 beats per minute higher than my waking heart rate. And I'm involved in deep struggle. The ego is struggling to hang on in the sleep state. And the ego is I've got all kinds of these things that are arising where just the ego is just putting up more roadblocks and more roadblocks to prevent its own demise. So old conditioned habits come back. It's another thing you can expect. Things that you thought, right, that dropped away decades ago will come back. So it's kind of like the ego's got, okay, so the bag of tricks I have here that that are fresh, they aren't working. Let me see if something from when you were 18 years old will work, or like 20, or something that you worked through. It'll come right, and you'll just be completely shocked. And this is just the ego's deep fear of its own demise. And this is what you're talking about, Iona. It's I didn't say your name right. Sorry.
It's okay. It's Joanna.
Oana. So it's this deep fear, and of course this can be terrifying for the ego, right? It can be terrifying, but even when we see this and we realize this, fear can prevent it from totally manifesting, and we start to struggle again. So we really have to, I know it's easy to say, oh, just open to the fear. I've talked to different teachers, and it's one of the instruction is to open to the fear. For me, it's to not judge the struggling of the ego at this point, is to accept that the ego, that's what the ego is doing, is it's struggling, and it's just noticing that this is what's going on. That's all I can do at this point. Thanks for bringing that up. It's
Thank you.
it's really at the juncture of the ego, starting to fall away when that fear gets quite intense. Somebody was going to say something. That I see a Marine.
Yeah. So I think what puzzles me is the egoic struggle goes across all cultures. And it seems to have evolved just in our species. And I wonder, there must be some adaptive advantage to it. That's what puzzles me. It just seems to be a normal state of human existence.
Mm-hmm.
And what's it there for? What's the adaptive advantage of having the ego and having the constant struggle? Perhaps some people just on their own, develop to a point where they learn not to struggle. But I think for most of us, we don't get there. And so, yeah, what's the adaptive advantage?
How would having an answer to that question help you perceive your true nature?
That's a very good question. Perhaps it's my ego trying to say, oh, come on, this is just the normal state of affairs and the way we're meant to be, and that you can't change that. Maybe that's the answer to your question. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, because most of us are like this. But, I don't think my cat is. So why are we? Why did we evolve this way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's a big puzzle.
Yeah.
That I grapple with all the time.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. So I can't help you with that one. I don't. Yeah, but there are all kinds of. I guess you could talk to evolutionists and brain folks about how survival brain and prefrontal cortex evolved and all that, and how the survival brain still runs us in many ways based on old conditioned habits, and the ego is somehow related to that. I think ultimately we are invited to just so what I'm wanting to teach here more is seeing in our direct experience no self. That makes sense. And really noticing that the more we struggle, the narrower we are, and the less we struggle, the wider and more open and spacious we become.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at a very experiential level.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Yeah, Yeah, not, I don't think it can be intellectualized
Yeah.
because there's the ego getting all balled up in it again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's the danger of being a teacher, right? The ego can get very involved in this teaching enterprise, right? And can really distract a practitioner from directly experiencing the teachings, and it just becomes more of an intellectual exercise. So part of my practice now is to really stay focused on the direct experience. Like the ego right now wants to write a book. That's the latest distraction technique. I'm going to sit in front of a computer now and I'm going to, it says, oh, you're a good writer. This would be a good contribution to the world. Which may be true, but I don't know. But it's definitely would distract me from directly engaging and seeing non-struggle and how much wider and more and spacious that can be. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Just a curiosity about when you were saying that time period where you had felt a lot of peace, but at night you felt like your ego was struggling. Like, how did that show up? What was that experience like? Like, was it really wild dreams or what was happening?
Yeah. So it's still happening, but not as intensely. So part of being at peace and at ease is the lack of struggle, right? So there's a lack of reacting to what's part of it is, you could say, is not reacting to what's happening internally and externally. So in the dreams, like it'd be like most ridiculous things, and I'd fly off the handle. I would yell at people and for taking a parking spot, or I, just just little silly kinds of. I was just reactive constantly. It was like a barrage of reactivity in the sleep state. And what was strange about it is I wouldn't wake up. Right, I would sleep through all this, and I'd get up, and with the Apple Watch, of course, it tells me my heart rate while I'm sleeping. I get up, my average heart rate would be 78, which is like 25 beats per minute higher than my waking resting heart rate. But yeah, just to answer your question, just very reactive events of reactivity and struggle, just never being with what is, quite the opposite of what I was experiencing during the day. And I actually had to call a teacher and ask about this, and I was told that this, that fear manifests for everybody in different ways, and this was how it was manifesting for me. And yeah, it's been going on probably for a year, but not as intensely now. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know if I don't know how helpful it is to hear about that detail of my experience, because everybody's unfolding will be different, but just like sort of brought it up, I guess, to illustrate how the fear of it, the ego's fear of its demise, so that will intensify, and not to be kind of surprised by that it seems to be part of the process. And I'm not the first one to experience this, so it's quite common that you'll hear teachers speak of this fear. So it's a process, I guess, of letting go of fear into fearlessness. Now I kind of know why they say. I used to wonder. You'd hear teachers say the journey on this path takes a lot of courage. And I always wondered what they were talking about. It takes some commitment. It takes, you know, a lot of other things, but I never really got the courage part until until recently. So, yeah, facing fears can be difficult. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Anything else on people's minds? Yeah. You're muted, Giovanni.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in people's mind, but it's really incoherent in my mind. And one of the things that comes to my mind is I'm struggling a little bit with the term struggle, what we mean, because you were mentioning before that too much emptiness is not great either, and I agree with that, and I I then try to reconcile that with the concept of struggling, and I'm thinking about the middle point, which is the middle way, which is Buddhism, right, the Dharma, and I'm thinking a little bit of struggle is not a bad thing. And again, what do we mean by struggle? So if I think I like red wine, a glass of wine, there's that opening, that tendency to have a glass of wine. So, but then if I like a second glass of wine, I start questioning myself. Is that a struggle? I would say yes. I'm struggling with that, and then I decide that I don't want to go past that point. And for me, the demarcation point is what creates suffering. If I get drunk, then that's past that point. I don't get drunk, but I'm saying if I would keep on drinking, I would probably get drunk, and that would create suffering. Whether I am wise enough or not to realize, but I think we agree that that can create suffering. I like $1 in my pocket, but if I don't pay my taxes and I cheat, that creates suffering. That may come after me. So if we mean that by struggling as well, then I'm thinking that some struggle is okay. It's fine. And again, I think too much or going too far is when it creates suffering. And that I also think I try to reconcile this concept of suffering also going back to the first section, the difference between the ego and the I and the me, the I. And I thought, okay, the ego is what creates suffering. The I is okay. Again, I'm simplifying in my simple mind, but I'm thinking about that middle point, and that a little bit of it is okay, so much of it is not okay. Might be not very coherent, but that's what's crossing my mind.
Yeah. So, yeah, well, you're kind of pointing to the difference between transcending ego and the ego falling away. So when the ego, and again, now we're perhaps getting out of I'm talking not in direct experience, but when the ego completely falls away, doesn't mean there's no preferences, right? No, it's not. It's the we have to look at the identification. So the self identifies with the ego as who if that's the misperception that I am, that the ego, I am my thoughts, I am my emotions, right? And there's an identification to the self. the I is identifying with the ego, the me. And that's in the ego, by its definition, is a struggling machine. That's basically what it does, is it struggles with what is, attempting to control its environment, its experience, to find happiness in its external environment. So that's what I mean, that's this whole enterprise is seeing how that creates suffering, and that when that ceases, the mind created unnecessary optional suffering ceases. That's the second and third noble truths. So there's no middle way with that one, right? That one's when clinging. So I'm just using the word struggle as another word for, right, craving and clinging, grasping and pushing away. Just really, I'm just using one word to. I kind of got sick of saying grasping and pushing away, so I started saying struggle. To me, it's the same, right? And the Buddha was pretty clear that that is what causes suffering, right? The dukkha. So that really we see. Then the invitation is in meditation to see what arises when that ceases, and then in our life, what arises when that struggle ceases. So I was simply pointing to really dwelling in those moments when struggle ceases, and the I and the me falls away, the ego falls away, or I should say more accurately, when it's transcended for that moment, to dwell in those moments, and really then see the direct link between craving, clinging, or struggle, whatever we want to call it, and suffering. Yeah. When I say, too much, and I'll just on this, when I say too much, I'm just going to mute you, Jill, because of some background noise. When I say too much emptiness, you can have too much. This is, I'm not saying here that, we need to keep struggling. What I'm saying here is, at some point we can get lost in emptiness to the point where we say, well, if I'm not in control, and everything is empty, then why bother doing anything? That's having too much emptiness, right? And that's not the point of this practice. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's quite the opposite. So that's when I talk about too much emptiness, that's what I'll be talking about, is how and really what it's talking about is, how do we engage in the world from this place of actually perceiving? So once the ego falls away, once the self as the observer falls away, then what? How do you engage in the world? Because the relative appearances are still all here. They don't go away, right? Human beings are still here. We're still relating with each other and living together. So that's another crucial question that we can explore. Yeah, these are all great questions. You folks keep me on my toes with with these questions, and you always give me something to reflect on with your questions and insights. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming on this beautiful August evening, and hope to see you next week.